What happens when a wealthy mother's pride collides with a dedicated teacher's principles? When Brandon Mitchell gets a B in math while a poor student scores higher, his mother Victoria storms into Riverside High, demanding answers. But Mr. Marcus Thompson, an experienced black teacher, stands firm in his grading, unleashing a chain of events that will shake the foundations of privilege, prejudice, and power. Who's really teaching whom about life's most valuable lessons? Dear viewer, don't miss this powerful story of integrity, transformation, and unexpected friendships. If you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you to subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now to join us for more heartwarming tales that change lives. Marcus Thompson stood before his 10th grade mathematics class, chalk dust clinging to his dark sweater vest as he wrote the final equation on the board. After 15 years of teaching at Riverside High School, he'd learned to read the subtle shifts in energy that rippled through a classroom. Today, that energy crackled with tension as 30 pairs of eyes fixed on the stack of graded tests on his desk. "Before I hand these back," he said, turning to face his students with a warm smile, "I want you all to remember something. A grade doesn't define you. What defines you is how you respond to both success and failure." From his front row seat, James Carter nodded slightly, his worn textbook held together with duct tape. Behind him, Brandon Mitchell slouched in his designer clothes, twirling an expensive pen between his fingers. The contrast between the two students couldn't have been more stark, but Marcus had long ago learned to see past such superficial differences. As he began distributing the tests, Marcus noticed how James's hands trembled slightly when receiving his paper. The boy's eyes widened, then a small, disbelieving smile crossed his face. 98%. The highest score in the class. Marcus gave him a subtle nod of acknowledgement, remembering the many lunch periods James had spent in his classroom, working through extra practice problems. When Brandon received his test, his face flushed red. 82%. Not a bad score by any means, but far from the perfect grades his mother, Mrs. Victoria Mitchell, had come to expect. Brandon crumpled the paper's edge, his jaw tightening. "I want to congratulate everyone on their hard work," Marcus continued. "I saw a real improvement from many of you. James, would you mind sharing with the class how you prepared for this test?" James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, conscious of the eyes turning toward him. I just studied whenever I could, Mr. Thompson. On the bus, during lunch, after my shift at the grocery store. My little sister helped me by quizzing me while I made dinner." Marcus nodded encouragingly. "That's excellent, James. It shows that dedication and creative time management can." The classroom door burst open. Victoria Mitchell stood in the doorway, her expensive handbag clutched tightly against her designer suit. Brandon's face went pale. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "A word, please." "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm in the middle of class. I'd be happy to meet during my planning period at now." She stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "My son just texted me his grade. This is unacceptable." The classroom fell silent. Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd be happy to discuss Brandon's performance privately. However, this is neither the time nor the place." "Oh, I think this is exactly the time and place," she said, her voice rising. "Everyone should hear this. You gave my son, who has had straight A's his entire life, a B, while giving the highest score to." Her eyes flicked dismissively toward James. "Well." Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, but kept his composure. "Mrs. Mitchell, every grade in this class is earned through hard work and understanding of the material. I don't give grades, students earn them. Is that what you tell yourself?" She laughed, a cold sound. "I wonder what the school board would think about a teacher who clearly has biases affecting his grading." The bell rang, but no one moved. Marcus straightened his back, meeting her gaze directly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'll ask you one more time to continue this discussion at an appropriate time. Your implications are both unfounded and inappropriate." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "We'll see about that. My husband is on the school board, in case you've forgotten. Perhaps it's time to reevaluate your position here." As she turned and stormed out, the classroom remained frozen. Marcus took a deep breath, then addressed his stunned students. Class dismissed. Remember to read section 4.3 for tomorrow. The students filed out quietly, many casting sympathetic glances his way. Brandon practically ran from the room, his test left crumpled on his desk. Only James lingered, clutching his 98% paper. Mr. Thompson. He started. Marcus managed a smile. It's okay, James. You earned that grade. Don't let anyone tell you differently. After James left, Marcus sank into his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he straightened Brandon's discarded test. He knew this wasn't over. Victoria Mitchell's threat hung in the air like smoke, but he straightened his spine. He'd faced prejudice before, weathered storms of bias and assumption. He wouldn't let it shake his principles now. Looking at the family photo on his desk, his wife Lisa and their daughter Maya beaming at the camera, he reminded himself why he became a teacher in the first place. To make a difference. To show every student, regardless of their background, that they could succeed through honest effort. The first battle line had been drawn. But Marcus Thompson had no intention of backing down. Victoria Mitchell's words echoed in Marcus's mind as he drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her threat had awakened memories he tried to keep buried, memories of his own high school days, 25 years ago. You must have made a mistake with my grade, Mrs. Harrison. No mistake, Marcus. You earned this A through hard work. But Jeffrey's father is saying. Let them say what they want. You earned this. Mrs. Harrison had been the first teacher to truly see him, to defend him when others questioned his success. Now, decades later, he found himself on the other side of that same battle. At home, his wife Lisa noticed his troubled expression the moment he walked through the door. Their daughter Maya was at basketball practice, giving them a rare moment alone. Victoria Mitchell? Lisa asked, already knowing the answer. News traveled fast in their community. Marcus loosened his tie, sinking into their worn but comfortable couch. She burst into my classroom, Lisa. Made a scene in front of everyone. Implied I was showing racial bias in my grading. Lisa sat beside him, taking his hand. Because you gave her precious Brandon a B. An 82%, Marcus corrected. While James Carter earned a 98%. He pulled out both tests from his briefcase, showing her the work. Look at the difference. James showed every step, understood the concepts deeply. Brandon rushed through it, made careless mistakes. And of course, it couldn't possibly be that a poor black student simply outperformed her wealthy white son, Lisa said, her voice tinged with familiar bitterness. Meanwhile, across town in the Mitchell mansion, Brandon sat in his room, staring at his phone. Messages from classmates kept popping up, most expressing sympathy about his mother's behavior. He hadn't responded to any of them. Brandon? His father, Richard Mitchell, knocked on the door. Can I come in? Whatever, Brandon mumbled. Richard entered, still in his business suit from a day of school board meetings. He picked up the crumpled test from Brandon's desk, smoothing it out carefully. Your mother told me what happened, he said, studying the red marks on the paper. She humiliated me, Dad. In front of everyone. Brandon's voice cracked. And now the whole school's talking about it. Richard sat on the edge of his son's bed. Tell me honestly. Did you study for this test as hard as you could have? Brandon's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. Richard sighed. Your mother, she wants what's best for you. But sometimes she forgets that best doesn't always mean easiest. Downstairs, Victoria was already on the phone with other influential parents, her voice carrying through the mansion's halls. It's absolutely unacceptable. We need to take action. That man clearly has an agenda. Back in the Carter household, James sat at their small kitchen table, helping his sister with her homework while their mother prepared dinner after her double shift at the diner. Mom, James said hesitantly, something happened at school today. Sarah Carter turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. Good something or bad something? Both, I guess. He showed her the test. I got the highest grade in the class. But Brandon Mitchell's mom, she got really angry about it. Said some things about Mr. Thompson. Sarah's face showed pride warring with concern. What kind of things? She basically said he only gave me a good grade because... James trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. His mother's face hardened. Because you're black. Because we're not rich like them. She sat down heavily. Baby, you listen to me. You earned that grade. Mr. Thompson is a good teacher who grades fairly. Don't let anyone take your achievements away from you. Back at Riverside High, Marcus sat alone in his classroom, staying late to grade papers. On his desk, beside the family photo, sat another frame, a picture of him with Mrs. Harrison at his high school graduation. She'd passed away years ago, but her words still guided him. You taught me that excellence knows no color, no class, he murmured to her image. I won't let them forget that lesson. His phone buzzed, an email from the school board requesting a meeting tomorrow morning. Victoria Mitchell had wasted no time. Marcus straightened his shoulders, remembering Mrs. Harrison's strength, his wife's support, and the look of pride on James's face when he saw his grade. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. And Marcus Thompson had been preparing for this one his entire life. The parent-teacher conference room at Riverside High had never felt smaller. Marcus sat at the long table, his posture straight but relaxed, as parents filed in for the scheduled evening meetings. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across concerned faces. Victoria Mitchell had made sure word of the special meeting spread throughout the parent community. What should have been a routine conference had turned into an impromptu tribunal, with nearly 30 parents in attendance. Principal Diana Roberts sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Mitchell, since you called this meeting, please share your concerns. Victoria stood, smoothing her silk blouse. Gladly. For those who don't know me, I'm Victoria Mitchell, Brandon's mother. I'm here because I've discovered a disturbing pattern of discrimination in Mr. Thompson's grading practices. Marcus felt every eye in the room turn to him. He remained composed, years of classroom management helping him maintain his professional demeanor. My son, who has consistently maintained excellent grades, recently received a B on his math test, Victoria continued, her voice rising. Meanwhile, a student from a different background received the highest score. When I questioned this, Mr. Thompson was dismissive and defensive. Sarah Carter, who had taken off work early to attend, spoke up from her seat near the door. You mean my son, James? Are you suggesting he couldn't have earned that grade honestly? Victoria's lips curled slightly. I'm suggesting that perhaps Mr. Thompson's grading criteria are influenced by factors other than academic performance. That's a serious accusation, Principal Roberts interjected. Do you have evidence to support this claim? I have years of Brandon's perfect math scores, Victoria replied, pulling out a folder. And suddenly, under Mr. Thompson's teaching, may I? Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He stood, walking to the whiteboard. I'd like to demonstrate something, if you'll allow it. He began writing out two solutions to a complex equation, one methodical and detailed, the other rushed with skipped steps. These are from the test in question. One earned a 98%, the other an 82%. He turned to face the parents. Can anyone tell me which solution demonstrates deeper understanding of the material? The room fell silent as parents studied the work. Finally, Mr. Chen, a local engineer, spoke up. The first solution shows complete mastery. The second solution, while reaching the correct answer, skips crucial steps. Exactly, Marcus said. The first solution is James Carter's work. The second is Brandon's. Victoria's face flushed red. How dare you publicly display? How dare I grade fairly? Marcus's voice remained level, but carried an edge of steel. How dare I recognize excellence regardless of who demonstrates it? How dare I uphold the principles of education that every child in this room deserves? Sarah Carter stood, her waitress uniform still on from work. My son studies on the bus to school. He studies during his lunch break. He studies after working his part-time job, helping me with his sister, and doing his chores. He earned that grade. This isn't about your son, Victoria snapped. This is exactly about our children, Marcus interrupted. All of our children. About teaching them that success comes from effort, not entitlement. That true education means earning your achievements, not having them handed to you. He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. I've brought every test, every assignment from this semester. I've brought my grading rubrics, my lesson plans, my tutoring logs. I invite any parent here to review them. What you'll find is that I grade based on one criterion only, demonstration of understanding. Principal Roberts took the materials, examining them carefully. Mr. Thompson has one of the highest success rates in our mathematics department. His students consistently perform above average on standardized tests, regardless of their background. Victoria wasn't finished. Well, I've already spoken to several school board members, including my husband. The new voice came from the doorway. Richard Mitchell stood there, his expression grave. Victoria, that's enough. The room fell silent as Richard walked to the front. I've reviewed Mr. Thompson's grading records myself. As a school board member, I can state unequivocally that there is no evidence of bias. As Brandon's father, I can state that our son needs to work harder, not look for excuses. Victoria's face went from red to white. Richard, you can't possibly. I can, and I am. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Thompson, I apologize for my wife's behavior. You're doing exactly what we pay our teachers to do, teach our children that real achievement requires real effort. The tension in the room began to dissolve. Parents started examining the grading materials, nodding in understanding. Sarah Carter caught Marcus's eye and gave him a small, grateful smile. Victoria grabbed her purse and stormed out, heels clicking angrily against the floor. As parents began to file out, many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or offer words of support. Richard Mitchell was the last to leave. This isn't over, he warned quietly. She won't let it go easily. Marcus nodded. I know. But I won't let any student down, including Brandon. After everyone left, Marcus sat alone in the dim room, his hands slightly shaking as the adrenaline wore off. He pulled out his phone and found a text from his wife. How did it go? He began to type, then stopped, remembering Mrs. Harrison's words from so long ago, sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones most worth teaching. The following week brought an uneasy calm to Riverside High. In Marcus's classroom, the atmosphere had shifted subtly but significantly. Brandon's seat remained empty for 2 days after the parent-teacher conference, his absence allowed silence in the front row. During those days, Marcus noticed changes in his other students. James worked with the same quiet determination, but now other students approached him for help during study periods. The invisible barrier between the rich kids and poor kids had begun to crack. At home, the Mitchell household was anything but quiet. Brandon sat at the kitchen island, pushing his breakfast around his plate, as his parents argued in the study. You humiliated me, Richard. Victoria's voice carried through the closed door. In front of everyone. You humiliated yourself, Richard replied evenly. And worse, you humiliated our son. Brandon set down his fork, unable to pretend he couldn't hear. His phone buzzed with another message from James Carter, the third one this week, checking if he was okay and offering to share his study techniques. Brandon hadn't responded to any of them. In the Carters' small apartment, James sat at the kitchen table, helping his sister with her math homework while their mother prepared for another double shift. You're good at explaining stuff, 12-year-old Lily said, finally understanding the fraction problem. Just like Mr. Thompson. James smiled, but it faded as he checked his phone again. Still no response from Brandon. Sometimes helping others helps you learn better too, he said, remembering Mr. Thompson's words. Sarah watched her children from the kitchen, her heart swelling with pride even as worry gnawed at her. The night before, she'd found James awake at 2 a.m., studying ahead in his textbook. Baby, you don't have to prove anything to anyone, she told him. I'm not proving it to them, Mom, he'd replied. I'm proving it to myself. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Marcus found unexpected support from his colleagues. Ms. Chen, the English teacher, shared how she'd faced similar accusations early in her career. Mr. Rodriguez from the science department described his own battles with prejudice. "We've got your back, Marcus," Ms. Chen assured him. Victoria Mitchell isn't the first parent to confuse privilege with merit, and she won't be the last. But support couldn't completely shield him from the strain. Lisa noticed how he stayed up later each night, meticulously documenting every grade, every interaction, every decision. Their daughter Maya found him asleep at his desk one morning, red pen still in hand. "Dad," she'd said, shaking him gently. "You can't keep doing this to yourself." He'd smile tiredly. "Sometimes standing your ground means losing some sleep, sweetheart." The situation reached a new level when Brandon finally returned to class. He slipped into his seat quietly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. During the lesson on quadratic equations, Marcus noticed the boy actually taking detailed notes for the first time. After class, Brandon lingered behind. "Mr. Thompson." "Yes, Brandon." The boy struggled with his words. I've been thinking. Could I maybe get some extra help? Like during lunch, or something?" Marcus felt a wave of emotion but kept his voice steady. "Of course. My door is always open." That afternoon, Brandon arrived for his first lunch tutoring session to find James already there, working on advanced problems. The two boys froze, staring at each other. "Perfect timing," Marcus said, pulling up a chair. "James, would you mind showing Brandon your approach to solving these systems of equations?" Slowly, awkwardly at first, the boys began to work together. By the end of lunch, Brandon had solved 3 problems correctly, and James had learned a new way to check his work. But the peace was fragile. That evening, Victoria Mitchell sat in her home office, composing emails to every school board member except her husband. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against the keyboard as she built her case, twisting facts and implications into a web of suspicion. In his own home, Marcus sat with Lisa on their back porch, watching the sunset. "Something's coming," he said quietly. "I can feel it." Lisa squeezed his hand. "Then we'll face it together. Like we always have." He nodded, thinking of Brandon and James working together, of Sarah Carter's fierce defense of her son, of Richard Mitchell's unexpected support. Sometimes the biggest victories came wrapped in the hardest battles. His phone buzzed, another email from Victoria Mitchell to the school board, CC'd to him deliberately. Lisa felt him tense. "Remember what you always tell your students," she said softly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being persistent," he finished, managing a smile. "About getting back up every time you get knocked down." Inside, Maya worked on her own math homework, proudly using the problem-solving techniques her father had taught her. In the Carter apartment, James helped his sister understand fractional equations. And in the Mitchell mansion, Brandon sat at his desk, actually working through practice problems for the first time in years. The battle wasn't over. But something had shifted, like the first crack in a dam. And sometimes, Marcus knew, that's all it took to start changing everything. The revelation came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Marcus sat in Principal Roberts' office, surrounded by years of Brandon Mitchell's academic records spread across her desk. The documentation had been requested as part of the school board's investigation, prompted by Victoria Mitchell's persistent complaints. "Look at this pattern," Principal Roberts said, pointing to a series of test scores. Brandon's previous math grades were consistently perfect, but... Marcus leaned forward, studying the papers. "The homework scores don't match the test performance." "Exactly." She pulled out more records. "And here's something interesting. His previous math teacher, Mr. Peterson, retired mid-year last year. The substitute who finished the semester had very different grades recorded. The truth began to emerge like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. During the 6 weeks with the substitute, Brandon's grades had dropped significantly. Then, mysteriously, they'd been adjusted upward before final reports. Victoria Mitchell made quite a substantial donation to the school that semester, Principal Roberts said quietly. Right before those grades were changed. Marcus sat back, the weight of this information settling on his shoulders. Does Richard Mitchell know about this? He's being informed today. She gathered the papers carefully. Marcus, you should know, some of your colleagues have come forward with similar stories from previous years. Meanwhile, in the school library, an unexpected alliance was forming. Brandon sat at a study table with James and 3 other students, their heads bent over practice problems. In the weeks since the parent-teacher conference, Brandon had started attending these informal study groups regularly. I don't get it, he admitted, pointing to a complex equation. I thought I understood this in class, but now. James slid his notebook over. Look at how I broke it down. Mr. Thompson taught me to think of it like building blocks, you can't skip any steps in the foundation. Brandon studied James's methodical work, a flush of shame coloring his cheeks as he remembered his mother's accusations. You really did earn that grade, didn't you? James met his eyes steadily. We all earn what we work for. That's what Mr. Thompson keeps trying to tell us. Across town, Sarah Carter was having lunch at the diner where she worked when Richard Mitchell walked in. She straightened, ready for confrontation, but his expression stopped her. Mrs. Carter, he said, may I speak with you for a moment? They sat in a quiet booth, an unlikely pair drawing curious glances. Richard placed a folder on the table. I owe your son an apology. And you? What do you mean? I've been investigating my wife's accusations against Mr. Thompson. What I found instead was a pattern of intervention on behalf of my own son. He opened the folder, showing her the evidence of grade manipulation. Your son earned his grades honestly. My son was given advantages he didn't deserve. Sarah absorbed this information, thinking of James's late-night study sessions, his meticulous work habits. What will you do about it? The right thing. Finally. Richard's voice carried the weight of years of looking the other way. Even if it costs me my marriage. Back at school, the truth was spreading like ripples in a pond. Other parents began coming forward with stories of Victoria Mitchell's interference in various school matters over the years. Teachers shared accounts of subtle pressures and not-so-subtle threats. In Marcus's classroom after school, Brandon stayed behind, his expression troubled. Mr. Thompson. Can I tell you something? Of course. Last year, when I was struggling in math, Mom said she'd take care of it. I knew my grades changed, but I didn't want to think about why. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Marcus studied the boy who had changed so much in just a few weeks. Brandon, you're taking responsibility now. That's what matters. James has been helping me actually understand the material, Brandon continued. It's harder than just memorizing answers, but it feels better. Real. Victoria Mitchell was in her home office when Richard returned with the damning evidence. Their argument echoed through the mansion, words like integrity and consequences bouncing off marble floors. You had no right to investigate behind my back. Victoria shouted. I had every right and responsibility, Richard replied firmly. As a school board member, as Brandon's father, and as someone who's allowed this to go on far too long, I was protecting our son's future. No, Victoria. You were teaching him that money and privilege matter more than honest effort. That's not protection, it's poison. In the Carter apartment, James shared his own news. I've been invited to join the mathematics competition team, he told his mother and sister over dinner. Mr. Thompson thinks I could qualify for nationals. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Your father would be so proud, baby. So proud. Brandon's on the team too now, James added. He's actually really good when he works at it. The next morning, Principal Roberts called an emergency faculty meeting. The room was tense as she outlined what had been discovered. The school board will be meeting tomorrow to address these findings, she announced. Mr. Thompson, your presence will be required. Marcus nodded, feeling the support of his colleagues around him. Ms. Chen reached over and squeezed his hand. The truth doesn't always set us free, she whispered, but it does show us the path to freedom. That evening, Marcus sat with his family, sharing the developments. Maya listened intently, then asked, Dad, did you know? About Brandon's grades before. I suspected something wasn't right, he admitted. But I believed in teaching him rather than exposing him. And now? Now the truth is doing the teaching. He smiled sadly. Sometimes that's the hardest teacher of all. The school board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but Victoria Mitchell launched her counterattack at noon. Her lawyer arrived at Riverside High with a carefully crafted letter, alleging a conspiracy to defame her character and threatening legal action against the school, the board, and Marcus Thompson personally. Marcus read the letter in Principal Roberts's office, his hands steady even as his heart raced. The threats were veiled in legal language, but the message was clear: back down, or be destroyed. She's desperate, Principal Roberts observed. This is her last play. It's a powerful one, Marcus replied, thinking of his mortgage, his daughter's college fund, his family's security. She has the resources to drag this out for years. Meanwhile, word of Victoria's legal threat spread through the school. Brandon learned about it during lunch period when he overheard other students discussing it. Your mom's trying to get Mr. Thompson fired, James said quietly. After everything that's come out. Brandon pushed away his untouched food. I have to do something. This isn't right. But Victoria wasn't finished. By mid-afternoon, she'd called an impromptu press conference on the steps of the school board building. Local news cameras captured her carefully constructed image of a concerned mother fighting against alleged discrimination. My only concern has been the fair treatment of all students, she declared, her designer suit immaculate, her expression a perfect mask of righteous concern. The fact that my questions about grading practices have led to this kind of retaliation speaks volumes. Richard Mitchell watched the coverage from his office, his jaw tight. He picked up his phone and made a call. Get me everything you can find on every donation, every grade change, every interaction between Victoria and the school system for the past 10 years. In Marcus's last class of the day, the tension was palpable. Students kept checking their phones, reading updates about Victoria's press conference. Marcus continued teaching, explaining complex equations with his usual patience, but he could feel his career hanging by a thread. After class, a group of students lingered. Led by James and Brandon, they'd prepared a petition supporting Marcus, signed by nearly every student he taught that year. We want to speak at the board meeting, James announced. To tell the truth about your teaching. Marcus felt his throat tighten. I appreciate that, but I can't let you get involved in this fight. We're already involved, Brandon stepped forward. My mother made us involved when she attacked you for treating everyone fairly. At home that evening, preparing for the board meeting, Marcus considered resigning. It would be easier, safer for his family. Lisa found him sitting in their bedroom, staring at his letter of resignation. Don't you dare, she said, taking the letter and tearing it up. Don't you dare let her win. Lisa, she has the resources to destroy us. And you have the truth. And your students. And every colleague who's watched you change lives year after year. She took his hands. Including mine, back when you were just the cute student teacher who helped me finally understand calculus. He managed a smile, remembering those early days. You only came to tutoring to flirt with me. And look how well that worked out. The school board meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Victoria sat near the front, her lawyer beside her, both radiating confident determination. Richard sat separately, a thick folder of documents in front of him. Principal Roberts presented the evidence of grade manipulation first, her presentation methodical and devastating. Victoria's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the pattern was clear. Then, to everyone's surprise, Brandon stood up. I need to speak, he said, his voice shaking but determined. About my mother, about Mr. Thompson, and about the truth. Victoria half rose. Brandon, sit down immediately. No, Mom. I'm done sitting down. Done staying quiet. He moved to the podium, pulling out his phone. I have recordings. Of you calling the school last year, arranging to have my grades changed. Of you threatening my old teachers. Of you telling me that people like James Carter couldn't possibly be smarter than me because of their race and class. The room erupted in chaos. Victoria's lawyer quickly called for a recess, but the damage was done. Richard Mitchell stood, adding his own evidence to his son's testimony. In the midst of the uproar, James Carter made his way to the podium. His voice, clear and strong, cut through the noise. "Mr. Thompson taught me that success comes from hard work, not from privilege or power," he said. He taught Brandon the same thing. And now Brandon's earning his grades honestly, and we're both better students because of it. Marcus sat quietly, watching years of Victoria Mitchell's carefully constructed facade crumble. He thought of Mrs. Harrison, of all the teachers who'd fought similar battles before him. Victoria, her composure finally breaking, stood to make one last attack. "This is a conspiracy. A plot to destroy my reputation, to undermine everything I've built." "No, Victoria," Richard interrupted. "This is justice. This is truth. This is what happens when we finally stop pretending that money can buy achievement." The board called for order, preparing to vote on the various issues before them. Marcus felt Lisa's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd stay true to his principles. He'd taught his students lessons that went far beyond mathematics, lessons about integrity, equality, and the real meaning of earning success. The breaking point had come. But sometimes, he reflected, watching Brandon stand tall despite his mother's glare, it's only after things break that they can be rebuilt stronger than before. The school board's decision was unanimous. After 4 hours of testimony and deliberation, they voted to launch a full investigation into past grade manipulations while affirming their complete confidence in Marcus Thompson's teaching and grading practices. Victoria Mitchell sat frozen in her chair as the board chairman delivered the verdict. Her carefully constructed world of influence and control was crumbling around her. But it was her son's testimony that had truly broken her. As the crowd began to disperse, Brandon approached his mother. His voice was quiet but firm. "Mom, we need to talk. Really talk, for the first time in, maybe forever." Victoria looked up at her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Gone was the child she could control and shape. In his place stood a young man with conviction in his eyes. "What is there to talk about?" she whispered. "You've destroyed everything I built for you." "No, Mom. You destroyed it yourself. But maybe we can build something better. Something real." Meanwhile, James Carter stood with his mother and sister, surrounded by celebrating teachers and students. Principal Roberts approached them, smiling. "James, your testimony tonight was extraordinary," she said. "But even more extraordinary is how you've handled yourself throughout this entire situation. You've shown true leadership." Sarah Carter wiped proud tears from her eyes. "His father always said our children would change the world. I just didn't know it would start so soon." Marcus watched these interactions from across the room, feeling a profound sense of both relief and responsibility. Lisa stood beside him, their daughter Maya having joined them after her basketball practice. "Dad," Maya said, "Brandon's coming over." Brandon approached the Thompson family, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know how to thank you. Not just for tonight, but for believing I could be better than what I was pretending to be." "You did the hard work, Brandon," Marcus replied. "You chose integrity over convenience. That's not an easy choice at any age." The next morning, Riverside High felt different. As Marcus walked to his classroom, students and teachers stopped to congratulate him. But it was the sight of Brandon and James walking to class together, deep in conversation about the upcoming mathematics competition, that truly moved him. In his first class of the day, Marcus wrote a new equation on the board: integrity plus effort equals success. "This isn't a mathematical formula," he told his students. "But it might be the most important equation you'll ever learn." During lunch period, a surprise visitor arrived at Marcus's classroom. Richard Mitchell entered, carrying a thick envelope. "These are my official resignation papers from the school board," he explained. "After what's been uncovered, I can't in good conscience remain a member. But before I go, I want to ensure that something good comes from all this." He pulled out a second document. "I'm establishing a scholarship fund. The Merit and Integrity Scholarship, to be awarded annually to students who demonstrate exceptional academic growth through honest effort. I'd like you to be on the selection committee. Marcus studied the document, noting that the first year would fund 10 full scholarships. This could change lives. It already has, Richard replied, glancing out the window where Brandon was helping another student with a math problem. Starting with my sons. Across town, Victoria Mitchell sat in her empty mansion, reading through years of emails and documents, evidence of her manipulation and interference. For the first time, she saw her actions through others' eyes. The weight of her prejudice and privilege sat heavy on her shoulders. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then dialed Sarah Carter's number at the diner. Mrs. Carter. I need to apologize. Not just for what I said about your son, but for what I believed. What I taught my own son to believe. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds before Sarah replied, actions speak louder than words, Mrs. Mitchell. If you're truly sorry, show it by changing. That afternoon, the mathematics competition team met for practice. Brandon and James sat side by side, working through advanced problems, occasionally helping other team members. You know, Brandon said during a break, I actually understand math now. Really understand it. It's not just memorizing steps anymore. James nodded. That's what Mr. Thompson always says, true learning changes how you think, not just what you know. 2 months after the school board meeting, Riverside High hosted its annual Spring Academic Achievement Ceremony. The auditorium was packed with students, parents, and teachers. But this year felt different. The usual divisions of wealth and status had begun to blur. Marcus sat on stage with other faculty members, watching as Principal Roberts approached the podium. This year has taught us all some valuable lessons, she began. About integrity, about true achievement, and about the power of standing up for what's right. In the audience, Victoria Mitchell sat quietly beside her husband. She'd spent the past months in counseling, confronting her own biases and their impact on her son. It wasn't an easy journey, but she was trying. The award ceremony proceeded, celebrating achievements across all subjects. When it came time for the mathematics awards, Marcus stood to present them. Before I announce our winners, he said, I want to share something my own teacher once told me, excellence knows no boundaries except those we create in our minds. He announced the individual awards first. James Carter received the highest achievement award for his grade level. Brandon Mitchell received the Most Improved Student Award. Both boys walked to the stage together, their friendship now a symbol of change in the school. But the biggest surprise came next. This year, Marcus continued, we're proud to announce the first recipients of the Merit and Integrity Scholarship. 10 students' names were called, a diverse group representing various backgrounds and circumstances. Each had demonstrated significant growth and commitment to honest academic achievement. Sarah Carter clutched her daughter's hand as James's name was called again. Lily beamed with pride, already dreaming of following in her brother's footsteps. Victoria Mitchell watched as Brandon applauded enthusiastically for each scholarship recipient. Her son had changed, and through him, she was learning to change too. After the ceremony, an impromptu gathering formed in Marcus's classroom. Students, parents, and teachers mingled freely, sharing stories and celebrations. Mr. Thompson, James said, approaching with Brandon beside him. We have something to show you. They presented him with a plaque, signed by all his students. The inscription read, to the teacher who showed us that true excellence comes from who we are, not what we have. Sarah Carter, now working fewer shifts thanks to James's scholarship, spoke with Victoria Mitchell in a corner of the room. Their conversation was tentative but genuine, building a bridge neither would have thought possible months ago. Your son has been a wonderful influence on Brandon, Victoria admitted. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful. Sarah nodded. Our boys have taught us all something about looking past surfaces to see what's real. Richard Mitchell, standing with Principal Roberts, outlined his plans to expand the scholarship program to other schools in the district. Change has to start somewhere, he said. Why not here? Marcus watched all of this from his desk, thinking of Mrs. Harrison and wondering if she could see how her legacy lived on. Lisa squeezed his hand, understanding his thoughts. You've built something beautiful here, she said softly. We all did, he replied. Every student who chose to work harder instead of taking shortcuts. Every parent who learned to value true achievement over artificial success. Every person who stood up for what's right. Maya, who had been talking with Lily Carter about basketball and mathematics, joined her parents. Dad, James and Brandon are starting a peer tutoring program next year. They asked me to join. Marcus smiled. Bridges built by students themselves are the strongest kind. As the gathering wound down, Brandon stopped by Marcus's desk one last time. Mr. Thompson. Mom asked if you'd be willing to meet with her next week. She wants to discuss volunteering for the scholarship committee. Marcus nodded, seeing the hope in his student's eyes. Tell her yes. After all, teaching and learning never really end. Outside the school, the spring sun was setting, casting long shadows across the campus. But inside room 247, the light of understanding, acceptance, and growth shone brightly, illuminating paths forward that would guide generations to come. 1 year had passed since the confrontation that changed Riverside High. On a warm September morning, Marcus Thompson stood before a new class of students, but the lessons learned remained fresh in everyone's minds. The school board's final investigation had revealed a decade of grade manipulation affecting dozens of students. The consequences had been far-reaching, 3 administrators had resigned, policies had been completely overhauled, and a new era of transparency had begun. Victoria Mitchell's journey toward redemption had been neither quick nor easy. After months of reflection and therapy, she'd made a public apology that shocked the community with its raw honesty. I stand before you today not as a wealthy donor or influential parent, she'd said, her voice trembling but determined, but as someone who lost sight of what truly matters in education. My privilege blinded me to the harm I was causing, not just to other students, but to my own son. Now, she sat in Principal Roberts's office, discussing her new role on the Merit and Integrity Scholarship Committee. The program had expanded to include mentorship opportunities and additional resources for struggling students. We've received twice as many applications this year, Principal Roberts noted, reviewing the files. Your advocacy has helped remove the stigma some students felt about asking for help. Victoria nodded, thinking of how far she'd come. When you've been part of the problem, you have a responsibility to be part of the solution. In Marcus's classroom, the evidence of change was everywhere. The walls now displayed not just academic achievements, but also stories of personal growth. A new banner hung above the board, Excellence Through Integrity. During lunch period, the peer tutoring program, started by Brandon and James, had grown to include students from all grades and backgrounds. The old cafeteria hierarchy had dissolved, replaced by groups formed around shared interests and academic goals. Brandon, now a senior, had become an unexpected leader in this transformation. His latest test score, an honestly earned 94%, sat on his desk alongside acceptance letters from top universities. You know what's funny, he told James during their tutoring session. Last year, Mom would have been disappointed with anything less than 100%. Now she's prouder of this 94 than any of those perfect scores I never really earned. James, who'd been accepted early to MIT, nodded in understanding. Real achievement feels different. Sarah Carter had been promoted to manager at the diner, her hard work ethic finally recognized. She'd also joined the school's parent advisory committee, her voice now valued in discussions about educational equity. Sometimes, she told Marcus during a committee meeting, it takes a storm to clear the air. Richard Mitchell had turned his focus to educational reform, working with other districts to implement similar scholarship programs. His marriage to Victoria, while changed, had survived, transformed by honest communication and shared commitment to making amends. The afternoon brought another milestone, the official adoption of new grading policies across the district, with Marcus's methodical approach serving as a model. Principal Roberts gathered the faculty to make the announcement. What began as one teacher's stand for integrity has become a movement, she declared. Every student deserves to know their achievements are genuine. As Marcus packed up his materials that evening, he found a note on his desk. Inside was a photo of Brandon and James at a recent mathematics competition, both holding first-place trophies in different categories. The note read, "Thank you for teaching us the true formula for success. B and J." Lisa found him staring at the photo, tears in his eyes. You did it, honey. You really did it. We all did, he corrected, thinking of every person who'd chosen truth over convenience, growth over stagnation, unity over division. The sun set over Riverside High, casting long shadows across the campus. But in those shadows, bridges had been built, stronger than any wall privilege or prejudice had ever erected. 2 years later, Marcus Thompson stood at a podium in the Riverside High Auditorium, addressing a packed house at graduation. As faculty speaker, he faced not just the graduating class, but a community transformed. When I began teaching, he said, I believed my job was to teach mathematics. I've learned it's really about teaching truth. The truth that real achievement knows no boundaries. The truth that integrity matters more than image. The truth that the strongest bridges are built when we dare to cross them together. In the front row, Brandon Mitchell and James Carter sat side by side in their graduation robes. Both were graduating with honors, their achievements now unquestionably their own. Behind them, their families sat together, the Mitchells and Carters, once divided by prejudice, now united by respect and friendship. Victoria Mitchell dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She'd spent the past 2 years working to transform the parent community, using her influence to promote equality rather than privilege. The scholarship program she now helped manage had expanded to 15 schools across the state. Your mother's really changed, James whispered to Brandon. So have I, Brandon replied, thinking of his younger self who once believed his worth came from his family's wealth rather than his own efforts. After the ceremony, the gymnasium filled with celebrating families. Sarah Carter, now taking business classes at community college, hugged her son tightly. Your father would be so proud, she whispered, touching the second honor cord around James's neck, the gold one that marked him as a merit and integrity scholar. Lily Carter, now a sophomore and member of both the mathematics team and the basketball team, couldn't stop grinning. Just 2 more years until it's my turn. Richard Mitchell, who'd recently been elected to the State Board of Education, shook Marcus's hand warmly. You started something bigger than any of us imagined. It just took one person willing to stand up, Marcus replied, and others brave enough to stand with them. The celebration continued into the evening with a special gathering in Marcus's classroom, now known throughout the school as Room 247, where excellence meets integrity. Current and former students filled the space, sharing stories and plans for the future. Brandon and James had both earned full scholarships, Brandon to Stanford, James to MIT. But their greatest achievement wasn't academic. They'd learned and taught others that true success comes from genuine effort and understanding, not privilege or prejudice. Mr. Thompson, Brandon said, approaching his teacher with James. We wanted you to have this. They presented him with a book, a collection of stories from students whose lives had been changed by the events of the past 2 years. Inside, messages of gratitude filled the pages, each one a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. Victoria Mitchell had written one of the longest entries. You didn't just teach our children mathematics. You taught us all that the most important calculations are the ones we make in our hearts when we choose between what's easy and what's right. Marcus shared the book with his family that evening. Maya, now heading to college herself, read the entries with pride in her father's legacy. Lisa squeezed his hand as they reached the final page, where Mrs. Harrison's photo had been placed alongside a quote, "Excellence knows no boundaries except those we create in our minds." The next morning, Marcus arrived early at Riverside High. The halls were quiet, but evidence of change was everywhere. Diverse study groups posted on bulletin boards, scholarship announcements celebrating achievement from all backgrounds, pictures of students helping each other learn. In his classroom, he found one last surprise on his desk, a frame containing 2 test papers. One was James's original 98%, the other Brandon's recent 94%. Between them was a simple message: different paths, same destination, excellence through integrity. As he prepared for the day's classes, Marcus thought about all the lessons learned, bridges built, and lives changed. The story that began with confrontation had transformed into one of redemption, growth, and unity. New students filed in, taking their seats. Marcus picked up his chalk and wrote on the board, today's lesson: the greatest equations are solved not just with numbers, but with understanding. A hand raised, a new student, looking uncertain but hopeful. Mr. Thompson. Could you help me understand this concept better? Marcus smiled, seeing in this simple question the continuation of everything they'd built. Of course. That's why we're here. To learn, to grow, and to help each other along the way. Outside his window, the morning sun illuminated the school grounds where students of all backgrounds walked together, their differences no longer barriers but bridges to understanding. The story hadn't ended, it had evolved into something more powerful, a legacy of integrity, equality, and the enduring truth that real achievement knows no bounds. Victoria Mitchell, walking past on her way to a scholarship committee meeting, paused to watch the scene in Marcus's classroom. She saw not the teacher she'd once tried to humiliate, but the man who'd helped her son, and herself, learn the most valuable lesson of all, that true worth comes not from what we have, but from who we choose to be. And in that moment, the circle was complete. This story reminds us that true excellence knows no boundaries of race, class, or privilege. In a world often divided by prejudice, the courage to stand for what's right can build bridges stronger than any wall. Every child deserves the chance to earn their success through honest effort, and every person deserves to be judged by their character, not their circumstances. If this story touched your heart and made you think differently about education, privilege, and integrity, please show your support by hitting that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that challenge perspectives and unite hearts. Together, we can create a world where merit matters more than money, and understanding bridges all divides.